There's a lot of stuff we have to get through in this episode, like literally there's a lot of stuff we have to sort through inside of the car. So let's just get right back to work, and we'll start with the rear sway bar end links. On the passenger side, we can see that the bushings are about ready to crack and fall off, but the bolt is still intact. The same cannot be said for the driver's side end link. That bolt snapped right inside of that lower bushing. In order to remove that broken bolt, we tried a few different things. First, there's the old-fashioned method where we just try to hit it with a hammer and hope we can break it off. Because of that rubber bushing bouncing back, the hammer doesn't really get us anywhere. It might be possible to put vice grips on the remainder of the bolt and remove the nut, but it's so rust welded in place that doesn't seem like an easy process. It's going to be unpleasant doing this upside down under the car, but I think we'll just go ahead and use the angle grinder to cut the bolt off. We'll make a cut diagonally across the center of the bolt where it runs through that spacer, because it's pretty much the only place to safely get an angle grinder against it. This is definitely a situation where it would be a good idea to use a face mask and hearing protection. After a minute or two of awkward cutting, we're through the bolt and the spacer wants to come loose. But that's hard to do with the sway bar still against it, so we'll leave that there for now and move to the other side. We'll go ahead and put a wrench on the nut and use the impact gun to turn the bolt loose. Well, we tried, but it just wasn't happening. With another set of hands to hold that wrench in place, this probably would have worked, and we could have either loosened the bolt or just snapped it off. Either way would have worked. But because of the awkward positioning, at the moment it was difficult to make that happen. After a few tries, we went back to the angle grinder and used that to cut the bolt off. The available space and the angle made this really awkward, so we kept stopping and trying to break the bolt off. But again, partially due to the rubber bushing holding it to the body, this never really seemed to get anywhere. And after repeating this a few times, we had cut about as far into it as we could with the angle grinder. What was happening was because of the weird angle, the cutting disc on the angle grinder was actually rotating the bolt and making it very difficult to get through. So to help finish off the bolt, we grabbed the reciprocating saw. The bolt vibrating around in that bushing made for a very unpleasant cutting experience. It made the bolt and the saw shake like a dog in a thunderstorm. And while the saw didn't hide under the desk or soil a carpet, it definitely didn't have a good time. But eventually, the saw worked its way through the bolt and the sway bar fell free. But then we still had an issue because that remaining piece of the bolt wasn't budging. That washer was also completely seized in place. So now that there's a little more room with the sway bar out of the way, we'll go back in with the angle grinder and cut a slot into the washer. We shouldn't have to cut it all the way through, but we need to loosen the connection between the bolt and the washer. And with that little bit of strain relief, we can take the hammer and knock the rest of the bolt loose. And finally, we can remove the end of the bolt from the body mount. But we're still left with the other end of the bolt stuck in the sway bar. Despite some attempts at persuasion, it still wasn't going anywhere. So we'll have to finish it off with yet another cut from the angle grinder. And finally, all the hardware for the passenger side is removed. Though of course we still need to finish off the driver's side. There's nothing left on the sway bar side, but we still have to take care of the rest of the bolt in the body mount. Since it's still seized in place, we'll cut a slot into the washer just like on the other side. The difference is, this side is even more stuck. After some hammering, we managed to break the washer in half, and it still won't come loose. It takes a lot of persuasion to knock the washer loose from the bolt and eventually get the whole thing loose. And at long last, both rear sway bar end links have been completely removed. And in their place we'll install completely new end links. These are from AC Delco and they were very cheap. They're just standard bolts with rubber bushings, but we're just looking to get this thing back on the road, so that'll do. This time, in an attempt to make it a little bit easier to line things up, we'll put the bolt through from the top. And to help prevent future issues, we have thoroughly coated it in anti-seize. As we install these parts, we'll need to build up the stack of washers and rubber inserts as we go. So, up top we have the bolt, and we're pushing it through a steel washer and a rubber bushing. And on the bottom, we'll slide on another rubber bushing, a steel washer, a steel spacer, a steel washer, and then yet another rubber bushing. Then we'll slide the end of the sway bar over the bolt and install another rubber bushing. And we'll follow that up with the last steel washer and the nut. To get the nut threaded on, we'll have to make sure the bushings are fully seated and push up against the bolt until we can get it to hang on. And now that it's started, we'll tighten it up a little bit more to make sure it stays in place. Then we'll slide the jack under the rear axle and lift up on the suspension to compress it a bit. This flattens out the angle of the sway bar to make everything fit better and is approximately ride height, which is where we want this to be. We'll make sure the car is still firmly on the jack stands, and then finish tightening up the sway bar end link. We're just going to use the factory spec and tighten it down to 12 foot-pounds. Some people don't like using torque specs for sway bar end links like this, and I can understand why. So if you'd rather do it without that number, tighten things down until the bushings start to squish. But here, we'll just use the torque spec and keep an eye on how much we're crushing the bushings. And we'll repeat that exact same process for the other side. We got both of the end links threaded together before tightening either of them. This helps ensure a good alignment and that both sides get tightened down evenly. But if you're having trouble getting a nut threaded on one side, it can sometimes help to install the other side and start tightening it down to lift the sway bar up a bit. You can also use a jack or clamps to compress the bushings, and sometimes you do just have to get creative. But for the rear of this car, we're finally done and both sway bar end links have been tightened down. And the new ones are certainly looking better than the old ones. Here's the pile of parts that used to be the sway bar end links. And here's the head from that passenger side bolt. The washer wasn't originally a part of it, but it's definitely a permanent fixture now. Oh, and speaking of broken rusty bolts, we have a similar thing to deal with back at the front of the car. We need to take a look at the battery hold down, specifically why there isn't one. So once we've loosened up the battery terminals, we'll remove the battery. And below it is the battery tray it sits on. It's a little bit rusty, but actually in better condition than most of the ones I've seen. At the rear of the battery tray, there is a stud protruding from the floor that is clearly broken off. We have a new battery hold-down wedge, although I did later find one in the car anyway, but we might as well use this one. The problem is that broken stud is too short to let us thread anything on. It would be possible to cut this battery hold down thin enough to let us thread a nut onto it, but instead I think we'll try to lengthen the stud to its factory height. For the piece of threaded rod we'll use to extend it, we'll cut the threads off the end of a grade 8 bolt. We'll try not to overheat it so it'll keep its high strength properties, but we'll see how it goes. We'll clear some things out of the way in the battery tray and hold the stud in place. We're holding onto the stud with vice grips that we're also using as a ground for the welder. It was difficult to get to the base of the stud to clean it up, so we'll have to use the welder to burn through some of the rust. After tacking it in place, we'll make sure it's aligned the way we want it and then fully weld it. Well, as best we can given the very limited space. Once it was fully welded, we realized it had shifted a little and gave it a few taps with the hammer to realign it. This was also a bit of a test to make sure it was on there securely. We'll also test fit the battery hold down to make sure it'll still slide down where it needs to be. Once everything is cooled down and we've pushed the wires back where they need to be, we can test fit the battery. The hold down fit over the stud without an issue, but we had to sand a bit off of one of the edges to get it to sit flush on the car. The problem was the angle of the sheet steel at the base of the battery tray. With just that little bit of sanding, this was an easy enough problem to fix, and everything fit nicely. We cleaned up the battery tray a little and gave that weld a quick splash of paint before reinstalling the hold down. We'll apply some anti-seize to the stud and tighten down the wedge with a nut and a washer. And now that the battery is nice and secure, we'll go ahead and reinstall the wires. At this point, the rear of the car was still up on jack stands. While it was there, we figured we might as well take a look at the rear drum brakes. In order to do that, we need to remove the wheel. In order to remove the wheel, we need to remove the lug nuts. In order to remove the lug nuts, we first need to remove their plastic caps. There was one missing here, but most of the lug nuts still had caps on them. And unfortunately, under the very first one we removed was a security lug nut. I don't have a bit for this, or even know what brand it is, so if we can't find a socket in the car, this is gonna be annoying. We unthread the rest of the caps and their normal lug nuts. Each wheel has one security lug nut. Without the security socket, what we would probably do is weld a hex nut on the outside of this lug nut and use that to unthread it. But at this point, we decided it was finally time to dig through all the stuff in the interior. So we'll leave those as is for now, and once again lift up from the axle and set the car back on the ground. And now that we know we have to find a security socket, it's time to finally take a look at the interior. There's a lot of stuff in this car, ranging from trash to tools to parts to ants. There were some of these little guys crawling around in the map pocket on the dashboard where there was something sticky. Whatever it was must have been sweet, and the ants were interested in it. Most likely, if we clean out the car and leave it alone for a while, the ants will clear out themselves. I left out a bowl of antifreeze for them, but none of them came to get it, and I didn't see any about 2 weeks later, so they're either gone or just hiding really well. As for the rest of the car, we're not going to give it a deep cleaning right now, we're just going to try to empty it out. There isn't too much food trash, but it's still pretty gross. As we go through it, the dark stains in the carpet and the overflowing ashtray start to make sense. We'll even pull out the floor mats and seat covers, basically everything that's not bolted down. For this first stage of cleaning, we'll just go ahead and dump everything into this container and we'll sort it later. The carpet in the rear passenger footwell is definitely the worst in the car. I really can't tell how much of it is cigarette ash or mold or what, but it doesn't look good. We did a minor amount of carpet cleaning and it seemed like it was coming out, so it's probably mostly ash. I'm not a fan of carpets in cars, but I don't really want to tear it all out either. Somewhere down the line, we'll really try to clean out these carpets and see what we can get done. Once the front and back seats are empty, we'll also empty out the hatch. We saw in the first episode that it was full to the brim. What we couldn't see below all those parts was that the carpet had been cut and a very rough fuel pump access panel had been carved into the sheet metal. A sheet of galvanized steel had been used to cover the hole in the floor and was held down with self-tapping screws and sealed with silicone. Interestingly, it had already been partially removed and was peeled up when I got to it. This leads me to believe that the fuel pump has been changed more than once, and the last time it was done, it was in a bit of a hurry. There was also a large rusted area on that piece of steel right below the hatch. Clearly, it had been leaking. We decided to remove this panel completely and took out the last remaining screws. Then we had to peel it away from the silicone holding it to the floor. It was pretty stuck on, but eventually it came loose. Now, I understand the reasoning behind cutting a hole in the floor to get access to the fuel pump, but it definitely doesn't have to be this big of a hole and it doesn't have to be this rough. Presumably, whoever cut this hole wasn't quite sure where the fuel pump was located and just decided to keep cutting until they were sure they could get to it. When I first saw this, I was a bit confused by the compression fitting, but I figured the lines just came out of the sender and ended there. But after looking a little bit harder and finding a picture of what it's supposed to look like online, it's clear that the lines have been cut. Without cutting those lines, you would have to remove a lot more sheet metal to get the sender out of the gas tank, but it's still not necessarily an ideal solution. Nothing seems to leak gas, but I would feel a bit better about it if we clean this up in the future. We'll leave that panel off of the car for now, and we'll go ahead and sort through everything that we put into the box. Clearly, not everything fit into the box, but that didn't stop it from being filled up. There's way too much to talk about all of it, but we'll sort through and talk about a few of these things. First up is a trash can, which humorously was the only thing in the car devoid of trash. We also have some extra windshield washer fluid and coolant. Something interesting that was in there are these canisters of refrigerant. These are unpierced cans of R134 with ester oil. Since these cans and the fill nozzle and adapters from a recharge kit are present, I'm guessing there were plans to get the AC functioning again and it just never happened. There's a variety of car cleaning products in there, including some that seem a little old. There's also a spare wheel center cap, which I'm not really sure why it's there, but I'll take it. There's a very rusty set of cheap wrenches and pliers and such that have probably been sitting in there a while. There's also a crusty old fuel pump as well as the box from one that was presumably new. It's probably safe to say that this Bosch fuel pump is the one that's currently installed in the gas tank. Here we have a big chunk of red steel, part of what was cut out to get to the fuel pump. We've got some more rusty tools and, oh yeah, a new pair of sandals. Nice. Now the car is paying for itself. There were a couple of these skull stickers in the box. I'm not really sure what the plan was with those. Here we have the sun visors. They're not looking so hot, well, except for that one, which looks like it almost caught on fire. We were able to figure out what most of the stuff in there was, but some of it is a little bit of a mystery. If it seems like it might go with the car, we'll still hang on to it. We've also got this cool utility clipboard with some old business cards and forms in it. And even a lottery ticket, although it's unfortunately not a winning one. It'd probably be expired anyway. We threw the seat covers in the box as well, though we're just gonna go ahead and throw those out. In the center console was this little tobacco tin full of coins. There are some coins from overseas, but the vast majority are from Canada, which makes me wonder if this car didn't take trips up north. Here we have what we started the search for, a little film canister, and inside it is the socket for those security lug nuts. That's handy to have. This appears to be some kind of wire harness adapter for an aftermarket radio, although it still has the stock one, so I'm not too sure why that's in there. There are some receipts and some trash and another bungee cord to add to the collection. And of course we have the rear view mirror. This was sitting in the passenger seat, so at least it wasn't hard to find. We had a similar problem keeping the mirror on my S10 Blazer, so we have at least a little bit of experience reattaching them. At the bottom of the box we have this nifty shotgun shell styled flashlight, and that's pretty much it. And that'll do it for this episode. The car still isn't clean, but at least it's not full of stuff anymore. Well, except for the ants.